big difference, I guess, with complexity, as a challenge that we're all facing, that society is facing, is that it requires practice. So the analogy I use is, if somebody comes to me and says, how do I learn how to sail a boat, or how do I learn how to do kung fu, or how do I learn how to eat with chopsticks, or how do I learn a different language? There's only one real way of doing it, which is you've got to do it. You can't study it from a distance and be like, I've read a textbook and studied sailing for 10 years and now I'm an expert at sailing. It just doesn't work that way. So complexity requires practice. And that practice shifts our way of thinking and shifts our way of seeing the world, but it's very action-oriented and very practice-oriented, very different from classroom learning.
This time on the Plutopia podcast, writer, strategist, and facilitator Zaid Hassan joins John and Scoop from Oxford, England. We discussed COVID-19, 10 and 10, and his work at Complexity University.
Hey everybody, welcome to yet another episode of the Plutopia News Network podcast. Our guest today is Zaid Hassan. Zaid is a strategist, a facilitator, a social innovator, and a writer. He's also co-founder of several ventures, most recently 10 and 10 and Complexity University. So we'll be talking about those quite a bit. Zaid, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on, John.
Oh, very happy to have you here. I've been looking forward to this. And I guess the first thing we should ask you is how things are in London.
Yeah, well, things in the UK are, as in many places, a little bit insane. So we are just going into another lockdown. We've had a big U-turn on Christmas, where most of England is now kind of locked down. People aren't allowed to meet each other, and we're also heading for sort of last-minute Brexit negotiations. So new regime in theory starts on the 1st of January. No one knows what's going on, so it's a little bit chaotic here at the moment.
Are you pretty much locked down yourself, sheltering in place?
We're so they've introduced a tiered system. So Oxford is in tier 2, but we're expecting an announcement to go into tier 4, which would be essentially shelter in place, lockdown, no real movement, no seeing anyone. So we're expecting that to come in a couple of days.
Cool. So you're in Oxford. I was thinking London.
Yeah, it's about an hour out of London.
Oh, cool. Well, so when we're talking about COVID, we've all been kind of trying to imagine what it'll be like for this thing to be over. And we can kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel, hoping it's not just an oncoming train. I wonder what you've been thinking about this. I know that, I saw the bit of graphical comic thing that you distributed not long ago that was sort of like envisioning a post-COVID era. What are your thoughts about what happens post-COVID and what the implications of that are?
Yeah, so it's been really interesting just to see globally how different countries have responded to the crisis, and so there's everywhere from US and Brazil, where numbers have really kind of gone through the roof. There's various responses in Europe, and I guess one of the things that I was talking to a friend of mine and saying, well, I wonder how we're going to cope when we have several of these viruses circulating at the same time. And he said, what are you talking about? I said, when the tundra melts and it releases all these organisms and viruses that we haven't seen in millennia, then we're going to have to deal with several of these at once. And they thought I was joking. So partly what I think is that there'll be two groups. There'll be groups of countries, communities that really learn from what happened, and there'll be countries and groups of people who don't learn from what happened. And I think that's going to be the determining factor of, how things unfold for us down the line. And, with this crisis, you've seen countries, like Taiwan and China that have really learned from SARS and previous outbreaks and really kind of put in place mechanisms and processes and structures to deal with it. So I just think that's going to be the determining factor. Do we remember or do we forget?
Do you think that power structures are going to realign because of this?
That's a good question. I I don't know. I mean, historically people say that post-pandemic you do get this realignment of kind of power structures and so on. And I think that in the US, just watching what happened with the recent elections has been interesting in that COVID did play, I think, quite a significant role in people's responses and people's voting patterns. So in some ways it's already happened. My guess is it just depends on what the end game is and how severe or not the end game is for different countries. And I think countries where things have been quite severe, like the UK, I suspect that it will cause a realignment or a restructuring of things.
One of the things that I've seen in the States is the disappearance of smaller businesses and the beefing up of the giants, the Amazons, the Googles, and that kind of business. Do you think post-COVID there will be some return to the old way of doing business, or is it only going to be the oligarchs, the monopolies?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I mean, the same thing has been happening here. And I think, we've seen massive business closures and the big kind of corporations, the Amazons are making huge profits. The plutocrats are making massive amounts of money. So I think that's probably the short term. And I think, the longer term or the more medium term picture. So I was reading somewhere that 2024, 2025, we should see sort of, an emergence, if you like, of the roaring 20s where economies sort of recover and spending recovers and so on. So my guess is that in the short term, we'll see sort of the large corporate structures surviving, whereas the small kind of, small, medium enterprises kind of suffer. But my guess is that they'll come back. I also think in terms of, the epidemic or the pandemic, that younger countries with younger populations have done in some ways much better in terms of, if you look at Africa, which has one of the youngest populations in the world, the pandemic hasn't had as much impact as it has in Europe, which has an older population. So my guess is that, there will be a preference to younger populations and populations that sort of survive it, and the recovery in, I think, Europe, North America, and other places with older populations is probably going to be a bit slower.
Yeah, some people think of COVID as kind of an evolutionary thing that culls the herd somewhat, that it's just a matter of like taking out the older people and making room for more. I think that's a bit of a stretch. I'm not sure who would make that plan, but it does seem to be having that effect to some extent. And I can imagine that actually one of the funny things here in the US is we started thinking, people are really concerned about the Republicans and Trump and the Trumpists. Well, those are the people who are putting themselves in harm's way. So we were wondering whether there would be sort of a Darwinian effect there, and they would just go away. But,
yeah.
But I wanted to talk to you a bit about your project, your current focus, 10 and 10. Which seems like a very interesting kind of organization. I'm not exactly clear how it's organized. Is it a nonprofit?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, it's a startup, so we're just kind of getting off the ground and getting going. So the structure is kind of emerging, but we're imagining that 10 in 10 is a nonprofit trust, and that part of it is Complexity University, which is really about building capabilities to respond to complexity. And we're imagining that Complexity University is a for-profit, but it's majority owned by a nonprofit trust. So any profits that it does make, some of that might go to investors and people who put in equity investment, but most of it will go to a nonprofit trust.
And that structure exists in that way for what reason? I mean, why would you make one a nonprofit and one a for-profit?
Well, I mean, so I think one of the challenges with working on, complexity and issues that really negatively impact people, like, I jokingly say the catastrophe industry is a growth industry, but really what you don't want to be seen doing in the midst of a catastrophe is profiteering and profiting from people's kind of misery and people's suffering. So really, the intention with 10 in 10 is that, we are working on issues and challenges that are potentially catastrophic for people, like climate change or mental health, but we do not want to profit from that. And actually that money should, but in bulk, by and large, be reinvested into figuring out how to tackle these issues.
So what's the overall mission?
So, I mean, 10 in 10's mission is, how can we tackle 10 complex challenges, 10 global challenges in 10 years? And the feeling we have is, given where the science is and just what we're seeing, is that we have this 10-year window. And we have this 10-year window to really tackle some of the most difficult challenges we're facing, including ecological collapse, but also things like inequality, which are really heading off the charts. And if we don't really make a dent in those challenges in 10 years, then we're sort of crossing tipping points that we won't come back from.
And the university is a big part of 10 in 10 because this is primarily an educational mission, correct?
Well, I mean, so, I worked most of my career on a consulting basis. So I, founded organizations, worked as a consultant for clients, and sort of by late 2017, I came to the conclusion that this isn't really going to work, in the sense that, an outside consultant coming in isn't really going to be tackling structural issues. And I can tell you a little bit more about that in a bit. But really, we identified 3 problems that need to be sorted out if we're going to tackle complex challenges like climate change. So one is capability, which is that, you can have all the money in the world, you can have all the resources in the world, but if you don't have the capabilities and the capacity to solve the problems, then you're not going to. The other is actual capital. If you're dramatically undercapitalized, you're also not going to solve the problem. And the final one is, what we would call standards, which is that, you have to be able to say what a good response is and what a bad response is and what the difference between the two are. And if you can't tell the difference, then you're in trouble. So really, 10 in 10's mission is to try and tackle all 3 of those problems, which is quite ambitious. And Complexity University is specifically about the capability piece, which is how do we build capacity? How do we build the right muscles to tackle these challenges?
And you're building capability just through trying to teach people to think, really.
Well, that too, but I think that, the big difference, I guess, with complexity, as a challenge that we're all facing, that society is facing, is that it requires practice. So the analogy I use is, if somebody comes to me and says, how do I learn how to sail a boat, or how do I learn how to do kung fu, or how do I learn how to eat with chopsticks, or how do I learn a different language? There's only one real way of doing it, which is you've got to do it. You can't study it from a distance and be like, I've read a textbook and studied sailing for 10 years and now I'm an expert at sailing. It just doesn't work that way. So complexity requires practice. And that practice shifts our way of thinking and shifts our way of seeing the world, but it's very action oriented and very practice oriented, very different from classroom learning.
You talk about seeing the world as being more like a forest than a clock. Can you kind of unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, and one analogy in terms of that shift of how we see the world is a little bit like, people used to see the world as being flat, and then that view shifted to seeing the world as a sphere. And if you think about navigating the world, and how you navigate the world changes depending on whether you see the world as a sphere, or whether you see the world as being flat. And similarly, we've had, I would say, sort of 100+ years where we viewed the world as being a clock, quite mechanical. And we can intervene in it as if we're dealing with a clock and fix it or engineer it. But the world obviously is not a clock. And as our understanding of complexity has grown, we've started seeing that we're not dealing with a clock. We're dealing with something that's more like an organism or an ecology, more like a forest. And that shift from seeing the world as a clock, from a clock to a kind of a forest, also should shift our practices. We're not intervening in a clock, we're intervening in a forest, basically.
You mentioned you were trying to promote hands-on training, and that goes against a lot of regular universities and college experiences, which is sit there, soak it up, and spit it back to us in a test. And how will your experience differ as far as confirming that the people are learning? Is it just a test, or do they have to go out and demonstrate that they can do whatever it is you're having them learn?
Yeah, absolutely. So the writer John Le Carre, who just passed away a couple of days ago, he wrote he had this great line that the desk is a dangerous place to view the world from. So it's a little bit like that, sitting inside a classroom in an enclosed lecture hall where somebody is lecturing you is a dangerous way of learning how the world works. And so the way we do it is we actually set people very specific and tangible challenges and that they have to complete. So for example, one of the areas we're working is in climate change. And so we start, so all of our courses are cohort based. So people are learning in teams and working in teams. So we set them a challenge and we say, you've got to tackle this challenge. And, the first challenge we set people is that you've got to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 1 ton of CO2 within 2 weeks. And you've actually got to do that in practice. And what we found with some of the early teams that kind of joined up and came to us is they would kind of go, you mean you want us to write a proposal for how we would do it? And we'd kind of go, no, we actually want you to do it. And they said, well, how are we going to actually do it in 2 weeks? And we said, that's what you're going to do. You're actually going to reduce, 1 ton of emissions within 2 weeks, and you have to figure out how to do that. And, we gave people some guidance as to the areas they can work in, but it's also, we're trying to get people to do direct emissions reduction. So it's not that, you can go and buy some offset somewhere and say, hey, we're done. But really, what are the practical skills required to practically reduce emissions by 1 ton, within 2 weeks? So that would be an example. And, half the teams succeed and half the teams fail.
Well, you said that you were not as convinced that a consultant was the way that you wanted to see things handled. And it seems to play into whatever you were just talking about, that consultants generally come in, give their wisdom, but they don't have any skin in the game, as the saying goes. They don't have a stake in the outcome. They just say, okay, do this, do that, see ya, bye, here's my bill. And
right.
Your approach seems to be more holistic, more skin in the game. For everybody participating, they have to have a stake in what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this issue of skin in the game is really, really critical. And as a consultant, you're right that you really don't have skin in the game, but also you're not invited to have skin in the game. So the example I would give is I was working for a foundation in the US, and they had a $3 billion endowment, and they, I'm going to slightly characterize it. This wasn't exactly what was going on, but it was a little bit like, you take your $3 billion and you invest it in coal, and then you get your 100 million back, and then you take the 100 million, split it into chunks of 100,000, and you give it to a bunch of activists and say, we want you to tackle the climate crisis. And it's a bit like, that doesn't make any sense, because we're financing the problem with our right hand, and then we're giving people tiny amounts of money with our left hand and saying, solve the problem that we're financing. Now, as an external consultant, if you come into that situation and say, this is completely bonkers, it doesn't make any sense, you shouldn't be doing this, it doesn't really go very far. So that's also one thing, that as an external consultant, you can't really tackle the structural issues. And it's exactly what you said, that, because you have no skin in the game, the rational analysis that you offer is very limited. It has very limited appeal, it has very limited weight, people can choose to disregard it. And there's very little incentives to kind of listen to a consultant other than when you agree with them.
So you have something now that you mentioned to me the other day, the Gigaton challenge. Did that emerge from your exercise within Complexity University?
Well, I mean, Gigaton, interestingly, emerged a long time before. So I was doing a bunch of work, with the UN COPs, so prior to kind of 2009, and advising a network of nonprofits that were entering the COPs to negotiate around the climate negotiations. And one of the things that happened was, in Copenhagen in 2009, December, there was an expectation that we're going to get a global deal, and that this is going to be a legally binding global deal. And the work would have been essentially done to some extent by civil society, and the onus would then pass on to governments to implement, a legally binding agreement. And obviously what happened in Copenhagen was that that agreement collapsed and there was no legally binding deal. So the question that I was kind of, one of my clients asked at the time was, okay, given this is what's happened, what should our strategy be? And so what we did was, we said to them, let's go back to the science and see what the science is saying. And we came back and said, well, the science is pretty clear. It's basically saying that emissions need to peak and decline by a gigaton a year for the next 40, 50 years. So the question becomes, what is our peaking strategy? So we went and interviewed a lot of people in the climate space, and we asked them this question, what is our peaking strategy if emissions need to peak within 5 years? And what we heard was one of two things. So either people said, Copenhagen was our peaking strategy and it's failed, or we don't have a peaking strategy. And for me, being someone relatively new at that point in the climate space, that raised a very pragmatic question, which is that if we don't have a peaking strategy, we're not going to peak, and that is the reality. And when I ask people this question, saying that, well, okay, the conclusion of what you're saying is that we're going to overshoot, people would say, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. And I would kind of go, sorry, I don't get it. You said we don't have a peaking strategy, and no one I've spoken to seems to have one, so therefore we are going. And people would kind of go, no. And what I found was there was a deep kind of dissonance at the heart of the climate policy conversation, at any rate, that there was reality, which is, we're going to overshoot, and then there was our capacity to accept this reality. So Gigaton basically kind of emerged out of that. And the question really we were asking was, what would a strategy where the numbers add up look like? What would a realistic, practical strategy where the numbers added up look like? And that's where it kind of emerged from.
And how does it work?
So, I mean, we kind of came to a really, a very, in hindsight, a very simple kind of insight, which was that, if emissions need to decline by a gigaton, which is 1 billion tons a year, and that's all of Germany's emissions in a year, roughly, or all of Africa's emissions in a year, the insight was this, that, the more teams you have, the easier it is. So if you have, 1,000 teams committed to a gigaton a year, their target is 1 megaton a year. Now, 1 megaton is still a lot. It's 300,000 cars roughly off the road every year. But if you have 2,000 teams, the target per team drops to 0.5 megaton. If you have 3,000 teams, the target drops again by a third. So to a third of a megaton. So what we realized is that, the more teams you have working on a shared global challenge, the greater the probability that we are going to crack it. And so that was the kind of core insight that emerged, and that is at the heart of Gigaton, which is that, if we can get more and more teams committed to a shared target, committed to shared standards for how to measure and get to that target, the probability of the probability of success essentially kind of goes up. And you can calculate the probabilities. You can basically say, look, here are the numbers, here are the number of teams we have, here's what these teams are doing. And at some point, if you have sufficient numbers of teams operating, you start getting real-time data. So you're not actually operating off ideology or paper proposals. You're actually operating from real-time data for what these teams are actually doing. And that's what we're trying to get off the ground.
And you can bypass governments this way, and policy issues, and just do it bottom up.
You can do it bottom up, but what I would say is that, the scale of the problem is such as that you need co-investment from multiple sectors of society and multiple people in society. And one of the things I would just say is that, the problem is so large that no one, governments, corporations, billionaires, no one is going to come and write a check for $2 trillion and buy a solution to the problem. It's not going to happen. So what's going to happen is that multiple people from multiple different communities, from multiple different spheres are going to co-invest. And they're going to co-invest not just financial capital, but all sorts of other capital, time, energy, money, infrastructure. And that co-investment will actually add up to a solution, or it won't. And so the idea is that it's really a challenge, if you like, to governments, to business as usual, to say, well, actually, you are not going to solve the problem on your own. You're actually going to require support from people on the ground, and they will co-invest, and that's the only way you're going to get to a solution. So really, it has to involve government as well, but it can't rely on government to basically say, look, nothing's going to happen until you decide to do something.
Yeah, it seems like you would have a clustering effect here. I mean, the more buy-in that you get at whatever level and from whatever sector, the more pressure there is moving up on governments and also on other sectors to participate in this, to pitch in and try to figure out how to address it. And it seems to me that governments have really been uneven in their response to the climate crisis. And of course, some haven't taken it seriously at all. We just had a 4-year run here in the US where it was like, oh, there's no climate crisis, or if there is, the economy is much more important than the climate.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, the obvious truth that that attitude kind of misses is that obviously, if you tackle the climate crisis, you also have to tackle the economic crisis. You have to tackle inequality, and you're actually not going to be able to tackle one or the other if you focus entirely on the economy, then you will get a situation like Katrina where, your city gets wiped out, and, where does your economy go in that situation? So the way we kind of see it is that for governments, it's almost irrelevant whether they think this is a climate effort or not. Really, they have to see it as an employment effort, as an equity effort, as an effort to actually employ people. So what our hope is that, we are able to go to governments and say to them, look, we have 100 teams. These teams are doing good work on the ground, and you can finance these teams. And if you finance these teams, you're going to be employing thousands of people on the ground. It's a way of creating employment. 99.9% of the money is going to go directly to teams on the ground. You'll be able to say who you're employing. You'll be able to audit every penny of that, and you'll be able to see what has happened to that money. But it's essentially a way of creating employment. And so many governments announce employment plans and employment targets and job creation targets, and they have no way of actually going about it. So part of what Gigaton is, it's a how. It's not what we're going to do, which is clear what we need to do, but it's really a how. And the bottom line kind of impact is that, if a community isn't seeing financial benefit from tackling this crisis is not going to get tackled.
Yeah, I think that you have to, in order to tackle climate, and certainly in order to tackle inequality, you have to be able to assume that the government sees itself as existing for the support of the good of the people, and many governments do see themselves that way, but some don't, which speaks to our 4-year problem here in the U.S. again. We had a government that wasn't governing from that assumption necessarily. Some parts were and some parts weren't, but it became more of a question. And I'm very concerned. We have not globally done a very good job of tackling the problem of inequality. And part of that is because you have governments that serve other, needs or other. I mean, basically, you have some governments that exist to fill the coffers of the people who are in power.
Yeah, I think the challenge of those sort of governments is that they're a symptom of a deeper problem. They're obviously so big that sometimes we get blinded to cause versus effect. But I think that I think if people in the Rust Belt are seeing that the primary beneficiaries of tackling climate change are organizations like Goldman Sachs, you've got a problem, and it creates the space and it creates a vacuum for governments to, or for politicians to abuse that space and to come in and say to people, hey, we're going to look after you because these elites are not going to look after you. And I think it creates the conditions where we suddenly get these governments that are in some ways, filling their own coffers, nepotistic, autocratic in tendency, but they're a symptom of a larger problem that, we cannot have strategic responses to the climate crisis where the primary beneficiaries are the banking sector, for example. I mean, that is not going to work. And that will create the conditions for governments to come in and essentially, populist governments that essentially kind of prey on people to some extent. They're predatory, but we've created the conditions for those predatory governments to kind of arise because we haven't actually done anything that's benefited the poorest, the most vulnerable in our community, who are now kind of fed up and basically saying, well, I'll take a bet on this person who's saying they're going to solve my problems, even if we know really they're not going to manage it and these promises are completely empty. But it just creates the conditions for these governments to rise. And I think that's the mistake that we're making, that we can't mistake the symptom of bad government and predatory government for the cause of the problem. I think the cause is much deeper and much kind of it's a longer term problem that we've been seeing emerging over the last kind of 20 years, I'd say.
And what is your thought about the solution to that problem? How to address it?
Well, I think anytime anyone proposes a strategy for tackling our most complex challenges, we have to ask the question of who is the primary beneficiary. Who is going to benefit from tackling this problem? And if the answer is the beneficiaries of this are going to be the banking sector or the corporations, then it's a bad strategy and it's not going to work, and we should not support it. Now, if you come up with a strategy and you say we have a strategy to tackle the climate crisis, and actually the primary beneficiaries of those are going to be the poorest and most vulnerable in our society, then you've got something. Then you've got a strategy that could really work and it could be effective. So I think the solution in some ways is really simple. We just have to keep asking the question, who benefits?
So where are you seeing buy-in on the Gigaton challenge? Who is starting to participate?
Yeah, so I mean, we launched in October, and the way we structured it was we ran, a 2-week, what we call a sprint, in October, November, December. And what's been exciting is we've had, I think, about 30 teams join from around the world. So we've had teams joining from Europe, from North America, from a bunch of teams in India. And these teams were all set this target of, reducing emissions by a ton. A whole bunch of them met that target, and then they moved on to a second level, which was, we want you to reduce emissions by 10 tons. So a bunch of teams have undertaken the 10-ton challenge. But what we're seeing is that, the strategy as a whole seems to be working. We completely bootstrapped it. So, we did it with virtually no money, no resources. But we've had, a couple of hundred people kind of go through the experience. And a lot of people commit to continuing the work in the new year. But our hope is that, we can double or triple the number of teams that are participating and demonstrate again that actually this is a strategy that has legs and it could work. And it is very, very early days. But, we think that, 24 months to ramp up to actually getting megaton scale reductions is entirely possible.
Lately, I've been reading about people who at one time were environmental activists, climate change activists, have switched from that approach to adaptation activists, taking the assumption that it's not going to get better. So how do we adapt? And have you given that any thought?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, the crux, if you like, of Gigaton. So somebody emailed us and said, well, exactly what you said, Scoop, that they basically said, we think that we need to focus on adaptation efforts, and mitigation efforts really are not something that we want to invest in. So the way we kind of see Gigaton is that it's fundamentally about building capability on the ground, capability for taking action in the context of the climate crisis. And now, if you've got, a city where there are 5 teams or 10 teams on the ground that really have some capability to act, then they can decide what they need to do in that context. And we can label those actions mitigation, we can label them adaptation, but the point is that without that capability, you're going to get neither. So you need grassroots capability on the ground to act, whether you're going to act to mitigate emissions or you're going to act to adapt. And without that capability, you just get neither. So I would say that, I would not distinguish the capability as mitigation capability versus adaptation capability. It's like you need capability, you need capacity on the ground. Where is it?
Sounds like you're looking for more of a hybrid approach, a little of both schools of thought.
Well, I mean, one way of looking at it is that, what COVID has kind of taught us is we've had a visceral experience of complexity. And the visceral experience of complexity is that things change overnight. One day you can all basically be saying, actually, it's over. Then suddenly, in the UK, what we've had is we've had a new strain of virus suddenly arrive within 24 hours and everything changes, right? So the point of capability is that it can respond and react to changes in your context, depending on what happens. So if an adaptation response is needed, then your capability can pivot to that adaptation response and do what is needed, while simultaneously undertaking mitigation efforts. So what I would say is that it's more about the quality of your capability and how it can respond to changes in your context, rather than picking one and putting your bets on one or the other.
Yeah, I found myself wondering what kinds of, so you mentioned there are a bunch of teams that have already formed. What kinds of members do these teams have? Where are they coming from?
Well, it's been interesting. It's super, super diverse. So, sorry, we've got a team in India, for example. It's a bunch of college students who recently graduated who couldn't find work because of COVID, and they work in an industrial town, kind of doing odd jobs. And basically, what brings them together is they're a sports team, so they play an Indian sport together, and so they decided to kind of sign up. And what they started doing was essentially they started working in food waste and essentially their work is preventing food from going into landfill. And so, with 1 ton, they their target was 400 kilos of food waste. With 10 tons, they basically did 4 tons of food waste that they've avoided ending up in landfill. But the teams are really diverse from all over the world. We've got a team in Amman, Jordan, which is a lot of advisors to government, a lot of consultants, a lot of people working at a strategy level. So very different from this team that I was telling you about.
Do you have any like major corporations that have signed on or that include teams?
So no, not yet. I mean, I think that's where where we're going, is that we're looking for intact teams to join as well. So for example, we've had a team from the city of Halifax in Nova Scotia join. So this is essentially a public sector effort to reduce emissions in the city of Halifax. It's kind of led by the municipality, but there are also private sector members in that group. So they signed up all as a team basically. But that's kind of an example of it's a public sector team that also has corporations and energy companies and so on that are part of it. So our hope is that these teams become diverse teams, but that we can also have people coming from energy companies or big corporations that send a whole team and say, yep, we want to learn how to do this stuff, and we want to build our capability, build our muscles to do this work.
So are you networking these teams?
So basically, what's been one of the things that's been super interesting about doing this work is that COVID forced us online, so the work is kind of happening online, even if the footprint is in these cities. But we bring all these teams together, during the sprint, and they do various things like they peer coach each other. So we occasionally will pair teams up and basically say, okay, we have a team in Delhi, we want you to talk to the team in Montreal, and you're going to coach each other. So there's lots of opportunities for them to mix and kind of share notes and learning, but also to coach each other. And one of the pieces of feedback we've had has been that, it's been amazing being part of a global community engaged in a common mission, and actually seeing what people are really doing on the ground and being able to support teams in other places.
Yeah, when we were at World Changing, we were trying to build something like that. You remember the remote World Changing, the various cities that we brought on board, and one was for all of Canada. And that seemed like such a promising thing. If you could build some way to network a bunch of people with some common set of goals, that could be very powerful, and that it could be a way to spread influence as well, and that you could build a sort of like influential set of initiatives, which seems to be like what you're doing here. It seems like this challenge is well set to create a sort of gravity for this kind of effort.
Yeah, I think the nature of the climate crisis is it's so strange, and it's a little bit like the COVID crisis in that it's a global crisis. Yet, our actions are rooted in geography and in states and nation states and so on. So in some ways, by being kind of city-based, what we've done is we've transcended the national boundaries, and we've transcended the national policy level to say, well, actually, we can work together, we can learn from each other. And there, if there's a city in India that is tackling food waste, then London can learn from what that city in India is doing, and vice versa. So I think that the global nature of the crisis is something that I think could bring us together more. And we've seen this, with the work that Greta's been doing, and Fridays for the Future, is that there is a global challenge that we're facing, and how can we face that global challenge together while being rooted in our own communities?
One of the problems with teams that I've noticed, especially in like sports, but in the world of business and the world of politics, Steve, when you have a team concept, there are some among us, us not perhaps, but some that take the team concept a little too far and make it into a competition of we're going to beat that other team. How do you avoid that kind of roadblock to the whole process?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. So, one of the ideas with Gigaton is that, once teams reach a certain level of performance, we should really be financing them and giving them more than just technical support. And I was talking to a friend of mine who studied evolution, and I said to him, if we want to create a marketplace, we're actually financing these teams, how do we do that? And he said, well, what kind of marketplace do you want? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, if you want a competitive marketplace and I was in that marketplace, then I would take the money you gave me and I would just sabotage all the other teams. because that would mean I win. So that's a competitive marketplace. And I was like, right. And he said, but that's not the kind of marketplace you want, is it? And I said, no. He said, so what you want is a collaborative marketplace where actually teams are incentivized to actually support each other, and there are incentives for them to actually collaborate with each other. And I said, yes, that's the kind of marketplace we want. So I think the question becomes, what are the rules of the game here? That if you support another team and you actually help them and raise the bar on their performance, then are you both actually kind of winning, and do you get rewarded for that? Are you incentivized to do that? So the question, I think, is, what does it take to build a collaborative marketplace where teams are incentivized to actually support each other rather than they're incentivized to, sabotage and destroy each other, which is what typically you do in a competitive marketplace.
Yeah, it seems like you could learn a lot from studying cooperative businesses and how they're structured and how they work.
And I think you could learn a lot from studying games. Just online gaming, I think, as a phenomenon, is a really interesting space. And this friend of mine, that's his background. He actually studied evolution but applied it to games and said that you can create a gaming environment which is collaborative, or you can create a gaming environment that is competitive. So look at your marketplace almost as a gaming environment. What kind of game are you trying to create here?
Yeah, the interesting thing in cooperatives, I mean, I turned my business into a cooperative, and we had to figure out how to work together as a cooperative and without competition. Wasn't too hard for us because we were all sort of that mindset, and it was easy enough to get into. But in cooperatives in general, I think that there is such a strong competitive impulse. It's so much a part of various cultures, many cultures within the world, that's what you're actually having to defeat first, is that competitive impulse to get people committed to the good of all versus sort of just committed to winning for their part of the team.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that, so we use the language of unlearning, that you actually got to unlearn a bunch of things that you're taught and that you're trained to do. And I think that is one of them, that, you're really kind of our environment, our schooling, our education teaches us to be competitive, and really, how do you unlearn that? So just to take an example on the cooperative side. So, we're in initial conversations with some of the teams in India to say, okay, can we set up a 10-city cooperative where you become a food waste business that takes food waste from large hotels and large businesses or chains and actually composts that. And what would it take to create a 10-city cooperative to do that? So that's exactly right. That I think that we can incentivize people to be cooperative, and what Gigaton is, I think, also teaching people is that there is actually no way of tackling the climate crisis competitively. It's just not going to happen. That we have to actually learn how to collaborate. We have to build a new set of muscles in terms of how we work together. We have to unlearn, an ideological view or an ideological perspective that we've been taught, which is that, the only way of doing it is competitive. And to be frank, I think that there is, I kind of, competitive with a small c. So there's friendly competitive. There's, competitive as something that's fun and interesting to do without being destructive. So I think there are elements of competition that can be helpful, but I think ultimately the point becomes, how do we collaborate with each other without becoming kind of slack and flabby and kind of loose in what we're doing, but how can we remain agile and sharp and actually move at speed and deliver and be collaborative? And, if we're going to compete with each other, it's going to be fun to do. It's not going to be a destructive exercise.
So is this initiative connected to Complexity University?
Yeah, so we're housing, the Gigaton Challenge under the Complexity University umbrella. And the idea is that, if you want to learn how to tackle the climate crisis, then you can come to Complexity University, you can sign up to the Gigaton Challenge, and you can learn how to do that. And at a certain point, what we're hoping is that, teams that go through a couple of different levels and have demonstrated their competence and they're actually performing, they can kind of graduate into a marketplace where they're actually just financed to do the work.
And I guess that, the question occurred to me when somebody comes to you and they say, well, we want to set up a team, do you have like an orientation that they attend?
I mean, we've been having kind of long conversations about this in terms of how we do it, but really, we give them some orientation material, but we kind of almost tell them to turn up on Monday, and we give them the assignment, and we say, you've got 2 weeks to do it. We provide each team with 2 coaches, so they're given some support, but really we kind of push them into action quite quickly. So there's no kind of long planning cycle where you spend weeks and months kind of planning your intervention, what you're going to do. We literally get people moving into action within 24 hours of signing up. So they start on a Monday, and they start with a decision of where they're going to find their emissions reduction, and they start testing that idea out on Tuesday, and really by kind of Thursday or Friday they're actually implementing it.
So there's a list of challenges that you've been looking at, climate change being primary,
Mm-hmm.
but also there's water, agricultural and food, gender inequality, youth unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. Are you envisioning taking a similar approach to all of these challenges?
Yeah, I think so. So I think what we're getting in broad strokes with Gigaton is an approach and a way of organizing people and building kind of capabilities. But I think the same approach could work in water and agriculture. And my background is I've worked in a lot of those issues, so I kind of understand the nature of the challenge. But yeah, a similar approach I think could work in other areas. So inequality, gender issues, even we can work in those spaces and essentially build teams that are doing real work in those areas.
So are there like general approaches to these complex social challenges that you think can be broadly applied, taught and applied?
Yeah, and really that's partly what we're doing. That we run a course called Foundations of Complexity, and those teach kind of the core principles of what is a complex system, how do complex systems work, what is effective strategy in the context of complex systems, and those are just sort of generalizable, if you like, rules and rules of thumb that work in complex systems. And then obviously those manifest very specifically in specific contexts. So if you do something in Austin, it's going to be very different from doing something in Bombay or Delhi. But the broad principles of complexity as phenomena apply anywhere.
Yeah, on our end, we've been thinking and talking quite a bit about how, well, the social construction of reality, which is probably not the right way to say it, it's probably like the social construction of sense making and kind of how people make sense of the world. And it seems to me that efforts like this can lead to a sort of evolution of individual sense making so that people start to make sense in a different way, and that this is actually not just a means to an end, like a way to address climate change, but also a way to address like some of the problems we were talking about earlier, about um, that create governments that are unresponsive and that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back to that metaphor of seeing the world as a clock versus seeing the world as a forest. That if you start seeing the world as an ecosystem that you're a part of and dependent on for your health, for your well-being, then the way you participate in that ecosystem becomes dramatically different from if you see it as a clock that just ticks away regardless of what you do or don't do. So I think the key shift is really seeing ourselves as codependent, and as being participants, whether we're doing something or not, whether we're conscious of that or not. But really, again, the climate crisis is really a symptom of a deeper crisis, which is a crisis of our engagement. How do we relate to the natural world? How do we relate to the ecosystem that we're a part of? And that relationship is a little bit messed up, that if we see our ecosystem as being independent from us and actually doesn't really matter what we do to it, then we get in trouble, and that's the trouble that we're in. And I think that's the really, what I would say,
the kind of, to use a cliched phrase, that's the paradigm shift.
It's really great. I mean, to me, it seems like years after we were talking about world changing, you're doing the real heavy lifting for world changing, to change the world.
That's super kind of, and I see our work as being part of that wider community of people that have, for me personally, like I feel like I'm trying to manifest what all of us are trying to do, and the lessons that I've kind of learned from our conversations, from a lot of those early conversations in world changing. So, the way I'm seeing it is that, this is part of a broader, much wider effort. It's a visible part of the effort for sure, but I think that it's the product of, thousands of conversations and, hundreds of experiences in very diverse communities. And one thing I would just also say is that, it feels to me that sort of the big problem, if you like, with the UN process and the COP process is that it's a grand strategy. It's one major big strategy, and actually, I feel the time for grand strategies is kind of over. That what we need is, lots and lots of people trying lots and lots of different things out. So it isn't to say, what we're doing is right and what everyone else is doing is wrong. It's actually to say, actually, we need 1,000 boats heading in 1,000 different directions to try and figure out what's going to work. And if we're one of them, then that's great. And if we can share what we're doing and people will join us, then we'll figure out how to do this quicker.
I'm feeling inspired. So
Thanks.
as we wind down here, do you want to take a minute to tell people how to get access to Complexity University and the Gigaton Challenge?
Yeah, I mean, so the URL is pretty simple. It's complexity.university. And, in 2021, we are running several sprints. So we've got one in March. I would really encourage people to sign up and join in. One of the things about Complexity University, which is pretty unique and has been sort of the product of again, a kind of a long debate, is that you can pretty much pay what you want to join. So the idea is, as an educational model, is that we're trying to create pathways for people to do this work. And actually, you shouldn't be able to, you shouldn't have to pay, $1,500 to do a course to basically get on. So the idea here is that, you pay what you can, and you become part of a very diverse community where you have people who can afford to pay $1,000 for a course, and you have people who really, can't even pay $10 for a course, but you're all kind of working together to try and tackle challenges that are shared. So we're trying to build a pretty diverse community, and I think that anyone who kind of turns up, we try and make it work and try and figure out how to work with them.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Zaid, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me here. It's been great.
Yeah, let's do it again sometime.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to come and update you on what's happening in a couple of months.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we bid you farewell and good luck with these endeavors, and I'm certainly going to be paying attention and showing up.
Thank you. Thanks, John, and thanks, Scoop.
Thank you. You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lepkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.